La experiencia nos demuestra que la libertad económica es muy importante para la prosperidad. Sin embargo, no es tan fácil medir la libertad económica. Robert Olson, con quien voy a hablar en estos momentos, es uno de los especialistas mayores en el mundo en la medición de la libertad económica. Robert Lawson es doctor en Economía por la Universidad de Florida. Él es director del O'Neill Center for Global Markets and Freedom de la Southern Methodist University. Él es coautor de los informes anuales de Libertad Económica del Mundo y en los últimos años del Índice de Libertad Económica en Norteamérica. Esta conversación la vamos a hacer en inglés para que usted escuche directamente las palabras del doctor Lawson. Bob, thank you very much for being with us. Why is economic freedom so important after all?
Well, I think freedom is important to most people. I think if you ask most people, would you like to be free or to be controlled? Most people say, I'd like to be free. I think that's true in our economic lives. It's true in our political lives. We'd like to be free to vote. We'd like to be free to speak our minds, to write letters to the newspapers, if we still have newspapers. I don't know. But I also think people would like to be free to choose their own occupation, to hire workers of their own choosing at wages that they freely agree on, and those sorts of things. So just thinking about what people value, and I think freedom is one of the many things that humans value.
Okay, we do value freedom. We like to be able to choose whatever we do. But some people say that economic freedom is bad because it means that business people are going to take control of our lives and they're going to decide for the rest of us. What do you tell them?
You know, that may be true. From my point of view, and the reason we got involved with this measure of economic freedom was to measure economic freedom. Because if we measure economic freedom, we can find places that have a lot of economic freedom, places that have a little bit of economic freedom, and maybe places in the middle. And we can ask these questions. Do the places that have a lot of economic freedom, do they have bad consequences? Are the greedy businessmen really exploiting people or are they not? So the measurement, though, is a critical scientific tool that we need to help answer the kinds of questions that I think reasonable people would want to ask about whether freedom is good or not so good.
And how do you measure economic freedom? What are the criteria that you take into account?
Well, we started with a pretty basic classical liberal philosophical view of what economic freedom means. We started with Adam Smith, and we read Mises and Hayek, and Milton Friedman was directly involved in the foundation of this project. But at the end of the day, it's a data project. We collect data from the World Bank, the IMF, the United Nations, PricewaterhouseCoopers, the World Economic Forum. We collect data on tax rates, tariff rates, how many days it takes to start a business in different countries, and we have 42 variables that we use and we score. It's a very data-rich exercise.
What have you found? Which are the countries that have the most economic freedom?
Well, that's been an easy call for a long time. Hong Kong is the freest economy in the world. The tax rate in Hong Kong, the top tax rate is 15%. In my country, it's 50% in some places. They have excellent courts. They have no inflation. It's literally free trade. There are no tariffs of any kind. And regulations are just minimal in Hong Kong.
And if I remember correctly, Hong Kong was a very poor country in the 1940s, 1950s, extremely poor, and now it is the richest country in Asia, maybe?
It's
or one of the richest?
Arguably the richest country in the world. I think maybe Luxembourg by a small margin.
Which is a very small country.
Very small as well. So absolutely, it was devastatingly poor after World War II. And they put up growth rates of 8, 9, 10, 12% a year for 30, 40 years now. Well, you start at $1,000 in income. You wake up with $40,000, $50,000 in income after 3 generations or after 30 years like that.
What happened at the bottom of the scale? Which are the countries that have the least economic freedom?
There's been a little bit of churn there. Now, we don't have data on Cuba and North Korea right now because it's a data-driven index, no data for North Korea.
And clearly there are countries that do not enjoy economic freedom.
Right, yeah. So right now the lowest country is Venezuela. And it's one of the most tragic cases because...
It's peculiar because at one point in time it was one of the best countries in Latin America.
Indeed.
It was the richest country in Latin America at one point.
Indeed, and it was also one of the freest. We have data going back to 1970. I think in 1970 Venezuela was in the top 20 of the countries we scored in 1970, and now they're 159 out of 159.
What is it exactly that makes Venezuela be in the bottom? What have they done that have restricted economic freedoms?
It's pretty much across the board. We have the 42 variables that we have are put into 5 areas. It's size of government and the efficiency of the legal system, inflation, taxes on trade and regulation. It's across the board. I mean, we all know about the hyperinflation, so that's one of the 20% of our index would be based on that, and they get a 0 out of 10.
It's the highest inflation in the world right now, isn't it?
It's almost the highest inflation ever recorded in the history of inflation. The legal structure of property rights, the nationalization of industries. I mean, hotels being taken. You know, Chavez didn't like his treatment at a hotel, so he just takes it.
But Chavez and Maduro said that this was going to make people more prosperous. Has it worked?
No, it hasn't worked. In fact, the last 20 years, pretty much the period we're talking about, Venezuela has had exactly 0 economic growth. People in Venezuela today are no richer than they were 20 years ago. There
are countries like Singapore that have significant economic freedom, but a lot of restrictions on personal freedoms. What's your take on that?
It's a great question. You know, Singapore is number 2 right behind Hong Kong, and they're very similar in a lot of ways. It does highlight a point that we're measuring economic freedom, not necessarily personal freedoms of civil liberties and
although you might consider that also important.
I do. I consider it terribly important. There are other indexes of those things, and we felt that the missing link, so to speak, was economic freedom. A good friend of mine was kicked out of Singapore because he wrote an article in a newspaper that Lee Kuan Yew didn't like.
Okay.
So this is personal to me.
There is no freedom of expression,
Absolutely
but
not.
there is economic freedom.
Yeah, if you want to hire and fire, import or export, go about your business life, you're extraordinarily free to do so.
It's another example of a country that was dirt poor in the 1940s,
Absolutely.
and that it's is one of the richest in the world today.
Absolutely.
What happens with Nordic countries? We've always been told that this is an example of socialism, that supposedly they don't have economic freedoms, but is it true?
Yeah, I think if you'd asked me about the Nordic countries when I was a 20-year-old and I started working on this project, I would have said, oh, you know, Sweden is socialist. But one of the things I've learned and I've adjusted my thinking about is that they're not really that socialist. They don't control the means of production, to use the classic definition. They have high taxes. When it comes time to pay taxes in Sweden, it's a very serious tax rate. And their labor market's pretty regulated. But
although Sweden actually reduced corporate taxes significantly over the past few years.
At this point, they're not dramatically higher than a lot of other countries. But if you think about most things about a daily Swedish citizen's life, they wake up in a private home, privately owned home. They have a private bank account in a private bank. They work for Volvo, a private company which sells its products on the international market at global prices. It's a capitalist country.
And if they want to invest in a new business, there are no restrictions.
Absolutely. And if you get in a conflict, if you have a property right dispute, it's one of the most efficient court systems in the world, a very fair judiciary. So except for taxes and maybe some regulatory issues in the labor market, Sweden's as free market as the United States.
Tell me about the United States. It's been declining in the index.
Yeah, the U.S. for almost the entire period of our study was 3rd. It was behind Hong Kong and Singapore. And for many people, we thought the U.S. was the freest big economy because Hong Kong and Singapore are relatively small. And starting in 2000, the U.S. rating began to go down. Just a little bit at first. It went to 5th, 6th, and 9th. And in the most recent index, the U.S. ranked 16th. In the numerical sense, it's gone down by about 1 point, which we have a 10-point scale. A 1-point drop is a meaningful decline.
What have they done? What have the American governments do?
It's been a lot of things. Some of it is size of government. The taxes and spending is way up to fight wars and terrorism, Afghanistan, Iraq. But the biggest issue is the second area of our index, which is about property rights and rule of law. The rule of law measures that we get, which are mostly taken from the World Economic Forum, the group in Switzerland. The U.S.'s scores there have plummeted, frankly. They were 9s out of 10, which is a great score. Now they're 6s out of 10s. And I think that first the war on terrorism and the various controls that went in associated with that, and then later on the response to the financial crisis has given business people a sense that they can't get a fair deal from the U.S. Justice system. The legal system is no longer treating them fairly when they have a dispute with each other, or more importantly, when they have a dispute with the government.
I know you have a global vision on this, but tell me about Mexico. Are we doing right? We're not doing so well. What do you think about Mexico and its economic freedoms?
This is a tough question. I'm a gringo, and I can't claim to be an expert, but
Yeah.
you know, Mexico's been extraordinarily stable in our data in the index. Right now, it's middle of the pack. It's like 79th out of 159. It's
So
basically
we're not really very
middle.
good, but we're not that bad.
and has been really stable. There's clearly, to me, from an outsider's point of view, a sort of political equilibrium here. If you want to reform in either direction, if you're a socialist and you want to go the socialist direction, if you're
If we want to go to the
free market,
Venezuela way
you
or
need
the
Hong Kong way. Either way, you need to break the equilibrium. But it does seem that there's a very stable political kind of game going on here. The area of the index that Mexico struggles on is the same area the U.S. has gone down, and that's the legal structure area. Again, the scores there are 5s and 6s out of 10 in terms of impartial courts. People in Mexico are reporting that they don't think the courts in Mexico are impartial, that if you and I had a dispute, people don't think you know, that we would be treated the same. You're a famous man, you'd get treated more favorably perhaps than me.
Who knows, maybe
or
you'll
maybe
get
less
treated better.
favorably, I don't know. So that's the
But
kind
the point
of
is
thing.
that it wouldn't be fair. We don't have a
That's right.
fair justice system.
That's at least that's what the data say.
Is the war on drugs relevant to this
I
situation?
think it has. I think in the U.S. case, part of the reason for the U.S. decline, I think, is how the U.S. has approached the drug war. I mean, if you're a bank right now, and the amount of financial oversight that is imposed upon you in the name of
the red tape
in the name of the war on
banks,
drugs,
it's amazing now.
Yes, I think that's absolutely part of the reason, a major part of the reason for why these ratings have fallen for the United States, and I think it's one of the reasons why Mexico's ratings have struggled as well.
I know that you know, you're not a Mexican, you're not an expert on Mexico, but if someone in the government in Mexico, let's say that the president calls you and says, hey Bob, you know, I heard that you were here in Mexico, could you please tell me what should we do to grow quicker, to have a more prosperous Mexico? Is there anything you could advise us to do?
Yeah, so one of the problems is some of the things are really hard. It's hard to pass a new law to make your courts impartial. I mean, you already have.
Well, we might have the
you
right
already have
laws,
that
but
law.
that doesn't mean that they
Exactly.
work. Yeah.
So some of the things that are quick to fix. I noticed, I was looking at Mexico's data this morning. You have conscription. In our index, that's a component, and I think it's a 3 out of 10 now.
Conscription of soldiers?
It's well, any kind of compulsory service, whether it's for voluntary, for civilian
Yeah,
or.
it's
So
not really quite so much.
so-
We do have a compulsory military service, even though it's serving once a week. you
Yeah,
know,
exactly.
But we do have it.
Yeah, and you get a 3.
Okay.
And if you get rid of that, and most countries don't have it now,
Yeah.
it's a 10. I mean, from the index point of view, from my economic freedom index point of view, that would be an immediate boost.
Okay.
We have I notice a lot of capital controls. Again, I'm sure this is associated with the war on drugs, and maybe the war on terrorism as well, if you're cooperating on that end. But those are relatively easy fixes.
Robert Lawson, it is a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.
Y a usted, amigo televidente, que hace posible este programa, se lo agradezco también. Gracias por estar con nosotros y no se le olvide. Nos vemos la próxima.